This isn't just a story about getting even. It's about the fire you find when you're left with nothing but ash. It's about becoming the one thing your enemies never thought you could be, their superior. If you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever been told you don't belong, then stick around. This one's for you. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this ends. There are two kinds of silence. The first is the peaceful, empty quiet that lets you breathe. The second is the suffocating, heavy silence of a room where you are completely and utterly worthless. For 7 years, I lived in the second kind. It was the silence of my husband's mother, Vivian Turner, looking at me from across a polished mahogany dining table. It was a silence so loud, it broke my marriage, my spirit, and my heart. She thought it broke me. But what she didn't understand is that from the smallest, most broken pieces, you can build the sharpest weapons. When I first met Richard Turner, it was like stepping out of a black and white film into Technicolor. My life until then had been shades of gray. I grew up in a third-floor walk-up on the east side of town, the kind of place where the scent of your neighbor's cooking was a permanent resident in your own tiny kitchen. My world was the hum of a faulty refrigerator, the distant wail of sirens, and the view of a brick wall from my bedroom window. It wasn't an unhappy life, but it was a small one, defined by the things we couldn't have. I dreamed of safety, of a life where the first of the month wasn't a day of anxiety, but just another day. Richard was a lightning strike. We met in a dusty old bookstore, both reaching for the same worn copy of a classic novel. His smile was easy, genuine. He didn't just look at me, he saw me. He was ambitious, but kind. He spoke of his future with a casual certainty that I found intoxicating. He talked about building things, creating a legacy. He came from wealth, that much was clear, but he seemed different. He was warm where I expected cold, humble where I expected arrogance. He promised me a future that shimmered. A life where I wouldn't have to check the price tag on a carton of milk, a world beyond the brick wall outside my window. And I, a girl who had only ever known the constraints of a tight budget and a small apartment, fell completely and hopelessly in love with the promise. Our first year was a blur of stolen kisses in the rain, late-night conversations about everything and nothing, and the simple, profound joy of building a life together. We married in a small ceremony, against his mother's wishes for a grand society affair. It was our first and, as it turned out, our last real victory against her. And then I met Vivian Turner. The first dinner at the Turner estate was less a meal and more a formal inspection. The house wasn't just a house, it was a monument to generations of inherited wealth. Marble floors so polished they reflected your own nervous face back at you. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you down the hall, silently judging. The air itself felt different, thin and cold, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old money. Vivian greeted me at the door. She was impeccably dressed, a vision in silk and pearls, with a smile that was perfectly crafted, yet held no warmth. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were a piercing, intelligent blue. The kind of eyes that assessed you in a single sweeping glance, cataloging every flaw, every imperfection. "Sophia," she said, her voice smooth as cream. She took my hand, her touch light and fleeting, as if she were handling delicate but cheap china. "Richard has told me so much about you." I felt Richard tense beside me. "Mom, this is her. Isn't she wonderful?" Vivian's eyes flickered over my dress, a simple but elegant navy blue piece I had saved up for weeks to buy. "It's modest," she said, the word hanging in the air like a sentence. The entire evening was a masterclass in subtle psychological warfare. At the dinner table, the cutlery was so heavy and ornate it felt foreign in my hand. Every question Vivian asked was a carefully disguised trap. "So, Sophia, tell me about your family," she began, taking a delicate sip of wine. "My mother is a nurse," I said, my voice feeling small in the cavernous dining room. "My father was a mechanic. He passed away a few years ago." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," she said, though her tone conveyed no sympathy. Good, honest work. So important for society. It was the way she said society, as if it were a distant ecosystem she observed from a protected enclosure. She was in the world, but not of it. We, the people who did the honest work, were merely the staff in her grand hotel. Richard, bless his heart, tried to steer the conversation. Sophia's an amazing artist, Mom. She designs incredible jewelry in her spare time. Vivian turned her polished smile on me. Oh, how lovely. A cute hobby to keep you busy. It's so important for a woman to have little projects. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. My ambitions were cute. My background was honest. My dress was modest. I was being neatly and systematically placed into a small, harmless box, labeled inadequate, and set aside. The final blow came as we were leaving. Vivian placed her cool, dry hand on my arm. Her grip was surprisingly firm. She leaned in, her perfume a cloud of expensive florals. "You're a sweet girl," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But let's be honest with each other, shall we? A mother knows. Richard, he has a destiny. He deserves someone who isn't desperate." The word hit me like a physical slap. Desperate. It was the cruelest, most precise adjective she could have chosen. It implied that my love for her son was not genuine affection, but a calculated grasp for a life raft. It reduced my hopes, my dreams, my very being, to a pathetic need to escape my own life. I swallowed. I felt the hot sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of her. I just nodded, a tight, jerky motion. Richard was already at the car, oblivious. He hadn't heard. He never seemed to hear. That dinner set the tone for the next 7 years. My life became a gauntlet of Vivian's quiet contempt. At family gatherings, she would introduce me as Richard's little project, with a laugh that invited everyone else to join in the joke. The gifts I gave for birthdays or Christmas were always met with a condescending, "Oh, you shouldn't have. It's so thoughtful but small." She was an artist of the backhanded compliment, a virtuoso of the passive-aggressive remark. She never raised her voice. She never had a public outburst. It was always done with that serene, cutting smile. She would critique the way I arranged flowers, the way I dressed, the way I spoke. She'd offer helpful advice, suggesting finishing schools or etiquette classes, as if I were a feral child she was trying to domesticate for her son's benefit. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was Richard's silence. He loved me, I think, in his own way. But he was weak, utterly neutered by his mother's influence. When I would confront him, his eyes would cloud over with a familiar helplessness. "She doesn't mean it like that, Soph," he'd say, running a hand through his hair. "That's just how she is. She's from a different generation." She called my new business idea a cute hobby, Richard. In front of your entire family. "She's trying to protect me," he'd rationalize. "She's worried about us taking financial risks." But it wasn't about protection. It was about control. Vivian saw me as a contamination, a dilution of the pure, blue-blooded Turner line. I was a weed in her perfectly manicured garden, and she was determined to root me out, slowly and methodically. And slowly she succeeded. The constant, dripping poison of her disapproval began to erode the foundations of our marriage. Richard started to look at me through his mother's eyes. My ambition wasn't inspiring anymore. It was a risk. My background wasn't something to be proud of. It was a liability. The way I dressed, which he once called beautiful and unique, was now not quite right for the occasion. The love that had felt like a vibrant, living thing began to wither. Our apartment, once a sanctuary, started to feel like an outpost of the Turner estate, cold, silent, and filled with unspoken judgment. The man I had fallen in love with in that dusty bookstore was disappearing, replaced by a hollow echo of his mother's opinions. He stopped seeing me and started seeing the girl who wasn't good enough. The divorce, when it came, felt less like a tragedy and more like an inevitability. It was quiet, efficient, and overseen by a team of Turner family lawyers who treated me with polite, dismissive pity. I was given a small one-time settlement, just enough to ensure I wouldn't cause a fuss. It was, in their world, the equivalent of severance pay for a fired employee. The day I moved my last box out of our apartment, Vivian was there. She wasn't there to help Richard, of course. She was there to witness her victory. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, that same placid smile on her face. She looked at my single suitcase and a few boxes of personal belongings, the sum total of my life with her son. "I hope there are no hard feelings, Sophia," she said. I just looked at her, the woman who had systematically dismantled my life, my marriage, and my self-worth. There was nothing left to say. As I turned to leave, she spoke one last time, her voice dripping with the syrupy condescension I had come to know so well. "You know, you'll thank me one day. It's for the best. Girls like you can't survive in our world. It's better to go back where you belong." I walked out of that building and didn't look back. The city air felt cold on my face, but it was a clean cold. I had nothing. No husband, no home, no money to speak of. I was back where I started, with one crucial difference. The quiet, hopeful girl from the tiny apartment was gone. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose. And in the hollow space where my heart used to be, something else was taking root. It was cold and hard and patient. It was fire. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that one day, Vivian Turner would feel its heat. Leaving Richard's world felt like waking from a long, suffocating dream. The first few weeks were a disorienting blur of logistics and loneliness. I found a small, damp basement apartment that was even smaller than the one I'd grown up in. The single window looked out onto a concrete well where discarded cigarette butts gathered like fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and defeat. At night, I could hear the rhythmic clanking of the building's ancient furnace, a constant metallic heartbeat that kept me awake. This was it. This was back where I belonged. Vivian's voice was a constant, unwelcome guest in my head. Desperate. Cute hobbies. Girls like you can't survive. I'd be standing in the grocery store, counting out change for a loaf of bread and a can of soup, and her smug, smiling face would flash in my mind. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. I cried for the first month. I cried until I was dehydrated, until my eyes were raw and swollen, until there were simply no tears left. I had the settlement money, but I knew it wouldn't last. I treated it like life support, using only the bare minimum to survive. I sent out resumes for jobs in art galleries, in marketing, in anything that seemed remotely creative. The responses were a symphony of rejection. "We're looking for someone with more corporate experience. The position has been filled. While your portfolio is impressive, it's not what we're looking for at this time." The world seemed to agree with Vivian. I wasn't enough. One night, sitting on my lumpy mattress, which was also my sofa, I hit rock bottom. I was eating instant noodles out of a chipped mug, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. The silence in the room was absolute. I was 28 years old, divorced, broke, and utterly alone. The fire that I had felt on leaving my old life had dwindled to a single, sputtering ember. It would have been so easy to let it go out. To just give up. To accept that Vivian was right. I closed my eyes, and I saw her face, that radiant, triumphant smile as I walked away with my life in a cardboard box. And in that moment, something shifted. The ember didn't die. It flared. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Survival was too passive. This was about proving her wrong. It wasn't even about revenge. Not yet. It was about defiance. It was a cold, hard refusal to be the person she said I was. I got up, threw the rest of the noodles in the trash, and pulled out an old box from under my bed. Inside were my jewelry-making tools and some leftover materials. My cute hobby. I laid them all out on the floor, the metal and stones cool against my fingertips. I had always created things out of a love for beauty. Now I would create out of rage. My hands started to move, my mind finally quiet. I worked through the night, the only sound the soft scrape of metal on metal. I wasn't just making a necklace, I was forging my anger into something tangible, something beautiful. I used recycled silver and ethically sourced stones, a direct, conscious rejection of the Turner ethos of careless, disposable luxury. My work would have meaning. It would have a soul. I started a small online shop on a craft marketplace. I called my brand Ethel, an old word meaning noble, but I twisted the definition. It wasn't about noble birth, it was about the nobility of spirit, of creating something from nothing. I poured every spare cent and every waking hour into it. I learned about photography, taking pictures of my pieces against scraps of velvet I bought at a thrift store. I learned about search engine optimization, marketing, and customer service. My tiny apartment became a workshop, a photo studio, and a shipping center. The first few months were brutal. I'd make a sale here, a sale there. Just enough to buy more materials and pay my internet bill. I was running on caffeine and sheer force of will. I failed constantly. A batch of silver got ruined. A shipment went missing. A customer left a scathing review. Each failure was a fresh sting, a whisper of Vivian's voice in my ear. See, you can't do this. But every time I felt like quitting, I would pull out the memory of her smile. It was fuel. It was the whetstone against which I sharpened my resolve. I started a blog, writing not just about my jewelry, but about the philosophy behind it. I wrote about sustainable fashion, about conscious consumerism, about the beauty of imperfection. I wrote about the idea that your worth isn't in what you inherit, but in what you build. Slowly, agonizingly, something began to catch. A small fashion blogger in California bought one of my rings and wrote a post about it. Her followers started trickling to my site. Then another, bigger blogger featured one of my necklaces. The trickle became a stream. I started getting more orders than I could handle on my own. I remember the day I had to stop taking new orders for a week just to catch up. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by shipping boxes, and I laughed. It was the first real, joyful laugh I'd had in over a year. The next 2 years were a relentless climb. I moved from my basement apartment to a small studio with a dedicated workshop space. I hired my first employee, a young design student named Clara who shared my vision. I took out a small business loan, my hands shaking as I signed the papers. The loan officer, a stern-looking man who reminded me a little of Vivian's husband, looked at my business plan with skepticism. "It's a niche market, Ms. Carter," he'd said, peering at me over his glasses. "Are you sure there's a future in this?" "I'm not just selling jewelry," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm selling a story. And it's a story people want to hear." I got the loan. Ethel grew. We launched our own website. We got noticed by a few independent boutiques. The defining moment came when a well-known actress, famous for her environmental activism, was photographed wearing one of my bracelets at a film festival. The photo went viral. My website crashed. My phone started ringing and didn't stop. That's when the investors started calling. They were the same kind of men who would have once laughed me out of a boardroom. Men in expensive suits who probably golfed with Vivian's husband. My first pitch meeting was terrifying. I walked into a glass-walled conference room high above the city. 5 men in dark suits stared at me, their faces unreadable. They grilled me. They picked apart my numbers, questioned my supply chain, my growth strategy, my long-term vision. It was the Turner dinner party all over again, but this time, the stakes were higher, and this time I was ready. I didn't just answer their questions. I owned the room. I spoke with a passion and authority that came from having bled for my business. I wasn't the sweet girl with a cute hobby anymore. I was the founder and CEO of a brand that was redefining a segment of the fashion industry. They turned me down. Too risky, they concluded. The founder is too emotionally invested. I walked out of that meeting, the rejection burning in my gut. For a moment, the old despair washed over me. But then I looked at the city skyline, at the endless towers of commerce and power, and I felt that familiar fire return, hotter than ever. Too emotionally invested? My emotion was the entire goddamn point. It was the engine. I didn't need them. I would do it myself. I reinvested every penny of profit back into the company. I worked 16-hour days. I sacrificed friendships, dating, sleep. Ethel was my entire life. It was my child, my armor, and my future. And it worked. We grew bigger than I had ever dreamed. We expanded from jewelry into a full line of sustainable fashion, clothing, handbags, accessories. We opened a flagship store in a trendy downtown district. We were featured in Forbes, in Vogue. Sophia Carter, the girl from the tiny apartment, the girl who couldn't survive in their world, was on the cover of a business magazine. The headline read, "The Quiet Revolutionary: How Sophia Carter Built a Conscious Empire from Scratch." I kept a copy of that magazine on my desk. By the time I was 35, my personal net worth had surpassed the estimated value of the entire Turner family fortune. And unlike them, every single dollar of it was mine. I hadn't inherited it. I hadn't married into it. I had built it. With my own two hands, fueled by spite and instant noodles. I rarely thought of Richard or Vivian anymore. They were ghosts from a different life, a different person. They existed in a locked room in the back of my mind. But sometimes, late at night, when I was alone in my spacious, quiet penthouse apartment overlooking the city, I would allow myself to remember. I would remember the feeling of her hand on my arm, the condescending whisper, "You'll thank me one day." And I would smile a small, cold smile to myself in the dark. Because, in a way, she was right. I did have her to thank. She had given me the greatest gift of all. She had given me a reason to burn her world to the ground, just so I could build my own on top of the ashes. The foundation of my empire wasn't concrete and steel, it was the memory of her contempt. And there is no stronger foundation in the world. The news of the Turners' decline didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came in whispers, in fragments of information I pieced together over several months. It started with a small article buried in the financial section of a newspaper I was idly scrolling through on a tablet. Turner Industries stock plummets amid risky overseas venture. I paused for a moment, a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, but a grim curiosity, stirring within me. I read the short piece. It mentioned poor leadership and a series of high-stakes, ill-advised investments made by Vivian's husband, Charles Turner. It seemed the old patriarch's golden touch had finally tarnished. I tucked the information away and went back to my work. Ethel was in the middle of a major global expansion, and I didn't have time to dwell on the past. But the universe, it seems, has a taste for irony. A few weeks later, I was at a charity gala, one of those glittering events I now attended with a practiced ease that would have been unthinkable for the girl in the modest navy dress. A woman I knew vaguely, a socialite named Beatrice who moved in the same circles as the Turners, approached me by the champagne fountain. "Sophia, darling, you look fabulous," she gushed. "Your company is just everywhere. It's so inspiring." "Thank you, Beatrice," I said with a polite smile. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "Did you hear about the Turners? It's just dreadful. Absolutely tragic." She took a dramatic sip of champagne. "Charles lost everything." "Everything," Some disastrous bet on a South American mining company. They're selling the estate. Can you imagine? The house has been in their family for a century. My face remained a placid mask, but inside, my heart gave a single hard thump. The estate. That cold marble mausoleum where I had been so expertly dissected and dismissed. The thought of Vivian being forced to leave it was a potent image. And Richard, Beatrice continued, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my calm exterior, he's completely vanished. Packed up and moved to Dubai or Singapore or one of those places people run to when they can't face the music. Left his parents to deal with the whole mess. Can you believe the nerve? Actually, I could. Richard had always been a runner. He ran from confrontation, from responsibility, from any situation that required a spine. I excused myself from the conversation, my mind racing. The pieces were clicking into place. Bad investments. The fortune gone. The house being sold. Richard abandoning them. It was a perfect storm of their own making. A collapse brought on by arrogance, greed, and a fundamental weakness that had been festering under the polished surface for years. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about what this meant. This wasn't a revenge I had plotted. I hadn't lifted a finger against them. My revenge had been my success, my life, my complete and total independence from their world. This was something else. This was karma. It was the universe balancing its books. And I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my story with Vivian Turner was not over. A predator, when wounded and cornered, will often return to the place it once felt most powerful. She would come to me. It was inevitable. This knowledge changed something in me. The ambient rage that had fueled me for years began to cool, to solidify into something sharper and more deliberate. This was no longer about a frantic climb away from my past. This was about preparing for a final confrontation on my own terms, in my own territory. The planning began, but it wasn't a plot for ruin. The ruin was already complete. My planning was for the performance. The final act of a play that had started 7 years ago in her cold dining room. First, I instructed my executive assistant, a sharp, impeccably discreet woman named Anya. "Anya," I said one morning, looking out at the city from my office, an office that was twice the size of my entire first apartment with Richard. "I'm expecting a visitor at some point in the near future. She won't have an appointment. Her name is Vivian Turner." Anya, who knew the broad strokes of my past, didn't flinch. She simply nodded, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "And what should I do when she arrives?" "Don't turn her away," I said, turning from the window to face her. "Make her wait. Not for a few minutes. Make her wait for at least half an hour. Offer her water, but nothing else. And I want you to make sure she's seated in the main lobby, where everyone can see her." The lobby of Ethel headquarters was my creation. It was a vast, minimalist space with polished concrete floors, living walls of green moss, and a soaring atrium that flooded the room with natural light. It was designed to be beautiful but intimidating. It hummed with the quiet, focused energy of a successful enterprise. It was the antithesis of the Turners' stuffy, old-world mansion. I wanted Vivian to sit there. I wanted her to soak in it. I wanted her to feel like a relic in a museum of the future. "And when you do bring her up," I continued, "don't escort her yourself. Have one of the junior interns do it. Then bring her to my office and leave the door open. I'll close it myself." Every detail was a carefully chosen stitch in the tapestry of this final encounter. The wait, to establish my power over her time. The public seating, for her humiliation. The junior intern, a subtle message of her new, diminished status. The open door, a symbol that I was the one in control of the room. In the weeks that followed, I rehearsed the conversation in my mind. I played out every possible scenario, every angle she might take. Would she be arrogant? Doubtful, humbled, perhaps, pleading, most likely. She would try to appeal to my history with Richard. She would try to appeal to my sense of decency, a decency she herself had never possessed. I steeled myself against any flicker of pity. I remembered the basement apartment, the taste of cheap noodles, the sting of rejection letters. I remembered her voice saying, "Girls like you can't survive." Pity was a luxury I had never been afforded, and it was one I would not be extending. I had a recurring daydream. I imagined her sitting on the plush, low-slung sofa opposite my desk, a piece of modern art that had cost more than the settlement she'd given me. In the dream, I would just look at her. I wouldn't say a word. I would let the silence do the work. My silence. My office. My world. The same weapon she had used against me, now turned back on her, but this time it was a silence born of power, not of shame. The waiting was a strange kind of torture. Every time Anya buzzed my intercom, my stomach would clench. "Mr. Dubois from Paris on line 1. The design team is ready for the quarterly review." Life went on. The empire kept running. But underneath it all was a low thrum of anticipation. The blade was sharpened. All I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. The call came on a gray, miserable winter morning. The kind of day that leaches the color from the world. The rain was streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I was reviewing fabric samples when the intercom buzzed. "Ms. Carter," Anya's voice was perfectly calm, but I could detect a subtle shift in her tone. "There is a woman here to see you. A Vivian Turner. She says it's urgent. She does not have an appointment." My heart didn't skip a beat. It didn't race. It just gave one slow, heavy, final thud, like a gavel falling. The play was about to begin. I took a slow, deep breath, letting it out deliberately. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman looking back at me was not the girl Vivian had broken. This woman was calm, composed, and in complete control. "Thank you, Anya," I said, my voice even. "You know what to do." I turned back to my desk, picked up a fabric swatch, and pretended to examine it. But I wasn't seeing the color or feeling the texture. I was seeing a ghost, walking into a lobby she could never have imagined, about to face a woman she no longer recognized. The half-hour countdown had begun. It was going to be the longest 30 minutes of her life, and the most satisfying 30 minutes of mine. The 35 minutes that followed Anya's call were a masterclass in controlled patience. I didn't pace. I didn't stare at the clock. I sat at my large, minimalist desk, a slab of reclaimed wood and dark steel, and I worked. I answered 2 emails, signed off on a new marketing budget, and made a note to call our European distributor. On the surface, it was just another Tuesday morning. But beneath the calm facade, every one of my senses was heightened. I was aware of the soft hiss of the ventilation system, the distant city traffic muted by the thick glass, the almost imperceptible hum of the computer on my desk. My office was my fortress, and I was waiting for the siege to begin. I had orchestrated this moment down to the last detail. I imagined Vivian sitting in the lobby below. I could picture her perched awkwardly on the edge of a sleek Italian leather sofa, a piece of art in itself. She would be surrounded by the vibrant, youthful energy of my employees, people of every color and background, dressed in a casual, creative style that would look alien to her. She, in her dated Chanel suit that likely used to be a symbol of her status but now probably just looked worn, would be an anachronism. A ghost at the feast. She would be trying to maintain her regal posture, but the sheer scale and modernity of the space would be working against her, making her feel small and obsolete. The weight would be gnawing at her, stripping away the last vestiges of her pride with every passing minute. Finally, the soft buzz of the intercom. "Ms. Carter," Anya's voice was placid. "I'm sending her up with Maya from marketing." Maya was a 22-year-old intern, brilliant and ambitious, with bright pink hair. The perfect choice. A few minutes later, I heard faint footsteps approaching. Then, a soft knock on the already open door. Vivian Turner stood in the doorway, and for a second, the sight of her was so jarring that it almost felt unreal. The woman who entered my office was a pale, withered version of the matriarch I remembered. Her once perfectly coiffed hair was thinner, the color a little brassy. The expensive suit hung loosely on her diminished frame. The skin on her face seemed thinner, more translucent, and the sharp, intelligent blue of her eyes was clouded with desperation and fatigue. She was still holding her handbag, clutching it to her chest like a shield. The polished smile was gone, replaced by a tight, nervous line. For the first time since I had met her, Vivian Turner looked her age. She looked afraid. She hesitated at the threshold, her eyes darting around the expansive office. She took in the panoramic view of the city skyline, the curated collection of modern art on the walls, the sheer, quiet luxury of the space. This was a world of power, but it was a power she didn't recognize. It wasn't built on inherited names and century-old estates. It was built on grit and vision. It was my world.
"Sophia," she said, and her voice, once so smooth and cutting, was now thin and reedy.
It trembled, just slightly. I didn't stand up. I didn't smile. I simply gestured to the chair opposite my desk. "Mrs. Turner, please come in.
"Close the door behind you."
The click of the heavy glass door sealing us in together was a deeply satisfying sound. The finality of it. She walked across the polished concrete floor, her sensible heels making small, uncertain tapping sounds. She sank into the chair, which was so low it made her look even smaller, forcing her to look up at me. I remained silent, letting the quiet stretch. I let her sit in the discomfort, in the full weight of the role reversal. The power dynamic in the room was a palpable thing, and it was entirely in my favor. She finally broke the silence, twisting the handle of her purse. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I don't have an appointment." "My assistant mentioned it was urgent," I said, my tone neutral, betraying nothing. She took a shaky breath. "Sophia, I find myself in a difficult position." She stumbled over the words, the admission of weakness clearly costing her. "As you may have heard, my husband, Charles, made some unfortunate financial decisions. We are in considerable debt." I just watched her, my expression unreadable. I didn't help her. I didn't nod in sympathy. I gave her nothing. "The bank is foreclosing on the house," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "The house. The monument to her family's legacy. Her fortress. It's all we have left. Richard is abroad. He is unable to help." Her eyes, for the first time, met mine directly. They were pleading. It was the look of a drowning person searching for a lifeline. "You have done so well for yourself, Sophia. We see your name everywhere. Your success is remarkable." The compliment sounded like ground glass in her mouth. "You have so much. Surely you can spare something. A loan. Just enough to keep the house.
"I will pay you back every cent, I swear it."
And there it was. The ask. The reason for this pilgrimage of humiliation. The woman who once mocked me for being desperate was now sitting before me, embodying the very definition of the word. I leaned forward slowly, placing my hands flat on my desk. My voice, when I spoke, was soft. Dangerously soft. "Vivian," I said, using her first name for the first time in my life, a deliberate appropriation of the intimacy she had never allowed me. "I remember the dinners at that house. All of them." Her face faltered. This was not the direction she had expected this to go. "I remember the way you looked at me," I continued, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake. "Like I was something you'd scraped off the bottom of your shoe. I remember you calling my ambitions cute hobbies. I remember you telling me my dress was modest, as if it were a disease. I remember the weight of your silence every time your son was in the room. I let each memory hang in the air for a moment before delivering the next. I was rebuilding her gilded cage around her, bar by painful bar. And I remember very clearly, I said, my gaze sharp as glass, what you said to me the day I left. You stood in the doorway and you told me that girls like me couldn't survive in your world. You told me I should go back to where I belonged. Vivian's lips parted, a silent gasp. The color drained from her face. She was seeing it now. Not just a successful businesswoman, but the ghost she had created, now sitting in judgment of her. You were right, I said, leaning back in my chair. You were absolutely right. I didn't belong in your world. Your world of inherited status and casual cruelty. Your world was a cage. So I left. And I built my own. I gestured with one hand to the office, to the city skyline behind me. This is my world. I built it not with a family name, but with my own two hands. I built it on sleepless nights and ramen noodles and the condescending advice of people like you. This world has rules. And the first rule is, you don't get to burn someone's house down and then come to them asking for firewood. Tears were welling in her eyes now. Tears of desperation, of humiliation, of utter, abject defeat. Please, Sophia, she whispered. Have you no pity? I stood up, the motion smooth and final. It was the signal. The meeting was over. Pity is an emotion I learned to live without, Vivian. I don't owe you anything. Not my pity, not my forgiveness, and certainly not my money. Least of all, I don't owe you my success. I walked around the desk and moved towards the door. Good luck, Mrs. Turner. I opened the door for her. She rose slowly, her body trembling, her pride crumbling into dust with every agonizing step she took. She wouldn't look at me. She walked past me out of the office, a broken woman, the architect of her own demise. When she was gone, I closed the door again, the soft click echoing in the vast, silent room. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city. My city. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. There was no surge of triumphant joy. There was just quiet. The rage that had been my constant companion for so many years was gone. The burning fire had finally consumed its fuel, and in its place, there was a profound and peaceful emptiness. The second kind of silence. Not the oppressive silence of her dining room, but the serene silence of a debt finally paid. The silence of victory. She hadn't just lost her money or her house. She had lost her power. And that was a fate, for a woman like Vivian Turner, far worse than poverty. That was oblivion. The silence she left behind was my real reward. And it was more than enough. The best revenge isn't loud and explosive. Sometimes it's a quiet, closed door. It's the life you build in spite of those who wanted to see you fail. It's becoming so much more than they ever thought you could be, that their opinion of you becomes utterly irrelevant. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's just about watching the scales balance themselves. What did you think of Sophia's final decision? Was it justice, or was it cold? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have a story of your own, about overcoming the people who underestimated you, I'd love to read it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that building your own world is the only revenge that matters. Until next time.